Alright, so for those who don't know, this video is actually part 2 in a two-part series on the martyrdom and ultimate fates of the apostles. In part 1, I went over early church traditions, what we can know from early church fathers, and even some biblical references to potentially martyrdom or murder of the original 12 apostles or disciples, and how that could maybe lend to some sort of credence towards the hypothesis that the disciples were martyred. But that's not the whole story, which is why I'm making this second video to address some problems with this and also maybe how Revelation ties into Christian persecution, and then whether it was a political or ideological murder in the ones that we're pretty confident of. So yeah, stay tuned for that if you're interested. I'll link the previous video somewhere in here. I'll figure out how to do that. If you're interested in this video, I mean, I would love it if you stayed to watch. If not, all good. So yeah, let's get into it. Perhaps the early church fathers were making these martyrdom claims up as an apologetic to boost the credibility of their arguments. Well, some think not, though again, this is now moving into the realm of speculation. They said that these early church fathers normally argued that Jesus' resurrection was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy as their main way of establishing credibility and then converting people. But this is kind of just an argument from silence, as who's to say that they got no apologetic use out of it. Then again, they do seem to be getting some use out of it because they're citing it in the sources above. In fact, Clement is trying to convince kind of the church, a nearby church, I think it's the church in Corinth, to change their inner politics because he was unhappy that the Corinthian church, or whatever the church is, I might be getting that wrong, that church had kind of had an internal coup and thrown away, like basically fired many of their leaders, and he's trying to convince them that that's not okay and that shouldn't be happening in churches. It's not what Jesus Christ would want, and that they should bring those leaders back. So clearly, if he's actually citing it as a source in an argument, he's getting some use out of it. So that argument from silence just doesn't really work. Many other less credible sources also attest to the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, but if we're going to accept these accounts as historical, we also need to accept the resurrection of a smoked tuna, Peter repeatedly paralyzing his daughter, and then unparalyzing her, and then paralyzing her to keep her from seducing young men, more resurrections, and a magic battle between a wizard and Peter. And all of that was just like a few chapters and one source, by the way. So I don't think we should take these as historical. And this is something I hear all the time, that they needed a historical core to develop, but this is just a weak argument. This is just an assertion. A child might imagine something and tell their friend, I have a backyard, right behind my house, the one with the mailbox and the red paint. People play the telephone game with all their little kindergarten friends, and eventually it becomes, Timmy's a dragon in this backyard behind a house with a mailbox and red paint. Then these apologists are saying, oh, the backyard must exist because there must be some historical core. No, what if the historical core is just the combination of the other background knowledge, namely the mailbox and red paint? Why is this specific claim of martyrdom the fact that must be part of the historical core and not the legendary development? How do you know? People say, oh, they can't be complete fiction. How do you know which parts are fiction and which parts aren't? I agree with you. There are also a few examples outside of all of these church fathers I'd mentioned because, again, we can't really attest to whether or not they were sincere or telling the truth to the best of their ability in these mentions of Peter and Paul's martyrdom. Some of the clearest examples of ancient Roman historian corroboration are Tacitus and Suetonius, both of whom describe extensive Christian persecution under Roman Emperor Nero. Tacitus writes, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when the daylight had expired. So basically, Tacitus is saying that Nero, in the Great Fire of Rome, which we date to, I think it's 67 AD, basically needed somebody to scapegoat for these fires, and so he picked Christians because they're a minority group that a lot of people disliked, and also did some pretty horrific things to them. He used them as torches for his gardens, is what we can find, but that's just, like, that's terrible. Some people try to argue against this idea that Nero used Christians as scapegoats by saying that the term Christian could not have existed yet. We saw this before, and then moves from there to the assertion that Nero, then, because the term Christian did not exist, could not find any Christians, or what we'd think about was Christians, and then couldn't single them out as scapegoats. And once again, this is just simply semantics. Doesn't matter whether the term Christian was used, or whether it's just another sect of Judaism, or just, like, another religious movement. To move from the claim that this exact term was not used at the time to the fact that the group didn't exist, or couldn't be persecuted, that just doesn't follow. Regardless of this, it is questionable whether the term Christian was in use, depending on your dating back. Acts 11:26 isn't the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch, or the authenticity of 1 Peter. 1 Peter 4:16 says, "But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he's not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in his name." Depending on how you date those, it's kind of questionable whether the term Christian was in use. Hansen actually backs Moss up, saying that while people internal to the Jesus movement may have been able to identify each other, having intimate knowledge of their small group, this does not mean that external persons would be able to do so. This is just burden shifting, that of the burden of proof. Hansen and Moss are claiming that the Neronian persecution never really happened. I can respond, remember, this is their claim, I can respond with, Tacitus provides good evidence that the term was in use. They say, that term is anachronistic. It's talking about what they would call it in a later time period. Then I say, oh, but they could have just been recognized without that label. Then he follows up with, yeah, but they might not have. Prove that they were. No, you're making the burden of proof. You have the burden of proof. You're claiming something. This is just an assertion with no evidence. Hansen also says that there are no other references in any Christian sources of Nero's persecutions of Christians for 2 to 3 centuries, but this is only if one assumes that all of the above references to clear persecution aren't by Nero or the Romans around the time of this fire. This is circular reasoning. You're assuming your conclusion to prove it, and this is just doesn't, like, that's just a clear logical fallacy. Also, Tacitus is usually considered very reliable. Why would he randomly deviate on this point? He doesn't seem to have any motivation. And John Drinkwater, one of the world's leading authorities on Nero in this time period in Rome, said, a more recent alternative is that Tacitus retrojected growing concern at the spread of Christianity around 100 into events of the 60s. This is, however, to underestimate Tacitus's capacity for personal research, evidenced in both the histories and the annals. Though his culture and education encouraged him to treat his material rhetorically and morally, he was no dispassionate historian. This never drew him into outright invention. If we accept Tacitus's rediscovery of a forgotten historical fact, that the Neronian administration had accused a group of residents of Rome of setting the Great Fire and punished them accordingly, therefore probably executing them, we should also accept his identification of these as Christians. Also, his claim that there's no other early sources talking about Christian persecution is, like, kind of depends on interpretation. We can also corroborate this claim of Neronian persecution by looking at Revelation. This is clearly persecution. Actually, I might even make a video on this a lot, but I always have been taught that Revelation is like a literal account of what's going to happen, which, I mean, isn't there like a alien space prostitute and a bunch of, like, monsters and like, but the scholarly consensus is that's not at all the case. This is metaphorical and it's talking about Nero Caesar, and we know this because the beast number is 666. So ancient numbering systems used at this time use an alphanumeric method, like the Latin system we use today. Greek and Hebrew also use something like this. So basically, the first 9 letters represent 1 through 9, then the next 9 were 10 through 90, and then the next 4 were 100 through 400. Then all the higher hundreds could be made by combining lower hundreds, and this could be reused for thousands. Basically, these numbers are directly connected to letters. And when you plug Nero Caesar and transliterate that from Latin to Hebrew, a Hebrew spelling of his name gives us the number 666. This also would account for a textual variant in the book of Revelation. In fact, some early manuscripts gives the number 616. Why does that? Well, given the Latin alphanumeric system, Nero Caesar actually transliterates to 616. This is all to prove that Tacitus does not stand alone in affirming earlier Neronian persecution. So we've established these things about Peter and Paul, but we don't have much knowledge about the other disciples. Renowned Bible scholar Dale Allison writes, "The apologetical literature again and again avows that, since the 12 apostles and Paul gave their lives for the religious cause, or at least endured public scorn, persecution, and physical hardships, they must have been absolutely sincere in their beliefs. That is, they must have truly believed that God raised Jesus from the dead. I concur, as would most, that at least 4 of the witnesses in 1 Corinthians 15 through 3-8, Peter, Paul, James, the brother of Jesus, and James, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12, were martyred. I disagree, however, that we have much, if any, knowledge about the rest." Yeah, this is what I've been kind of saying. We only really know that these 4 remained active in the church and then were persecuted and potentially martyred, definitely killed, for their beliefs. We don't really have any other, reason to think that other than these 4, there were any other of the original 12 that stayed active in the church. There is potentially one source, which is Papias of Hierapolis. He's writing sometime between 90 and 120 AD. And actually, it's not actually him. He's being recorded by Eusebius. But basically he's saying, "If then anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I question him in regards to the words of the elders, what Andrew or what Peter said, or what was said by Philip or Thomas or by James or by John or by Matthew or any of the other disciples of the Lord, and what Aristoton and the presbyter John, the disciples of the Lord, say." This isn't really concrete evidence, though. This isn't even, Papias isn't actually saying this. This is being quoted by someone else, Eusebius. So we don't actually know if this is what Papias actually said. He could also just as easily be talking about earlier sayings attributed to them or to those disciples. Your interpretation here just depends on your pre-existing view, which can lead to a lot of bias in interpreting this. But overall, through all the sources I've spent a few weeks looking at and then presented in this video, we can attest to a few claims. So one would be, there's clearly a very strong tradition within the early church that at least Peter, Paul, and potentially a few other disciples, though unspecified in name and number, were martyred for their faith. This is what early Christians believed about the founders or earliest disciples. Second thing we could attest to would be that early Christians were persecuted and suffered, though whether it was political or ideological, at least in terms of murder, cannot be historically verified. We do know that many Christians were persecuted specifically because of their faith. And then 3 would be that Peter, Paul, and probably Stephen and James were killed for some unknown reason around this time. Maybe Stephen, we can have 3 to 5, probably more like 4, that we know were killed. But we don't know why. Historically speaking, at least. One of these 3 things that I think we can pretty clearly establish point to clear sincerity on the part of the 12 is up to you. For me, at least, it seems that I can say that Peter, Paul, and potentially maybe both Jameses were pretty passionate and truly believe what they're saying with good confidence. For the rest, I'm pretty agnostic. I don't think sources point any direction, as the evidence is inconclusive. Thanks for watching. Like and sub if you want. I'll answer any comments and stay lucid.